All right, our next speaker is Katherine Gideon, Katie Gideon. Katie is originally from Tulsa, Oklahoma. After graduating from the United States Naval Academy with a Bachelor of Science in Oceanography, she served 9 years on active duty as a surface warfare officer. She completed a Western Pacific deployment on board USS Boxer and was forward deployed to Japan on board USS John S. McCain. So here's the thing. Katie is basically a badass. She was a surface warfare officer. I feel really fortunate that we were able to have her be a part of this cohort. I've mentioned this before, but I do really believe that our cohorts thrive when we have lots of different experiences. To have Katie especially in our ocean law and policy class, when we're talking about the high seas or talking about the International Maritime Organization, things like that, and places like that, it was just really, really valuable to have somebody like Katie who has a cumulative, I don't know how many years of ship time under her belt. It was just really, really cool to have her in the room to give us a taste of real life and the real world out on these ships. So I'm just really appreciative that we were able to have her as a part of this year. And I'd love for you to join me in welcoming Katie Gideon.
Good afternoon. My name is Katie Gideon, and I'm here to talk about maritime grounding statistics, best practices, and policy evaluation, what I'm now lovingly referring to high and dry. First going to talk about January 17th, 2013. The 224-foot Navy minesweeper USS Gideon ran aground off the coast of the Philippines. The grounding occurred in the Tabatha Reef, which was considered a World Heritage Site. So now you're wanting to know what grounding actually means. Grounding means the ship has contacted the reef and the bottom of the ship so that the ship can no longer operate on its own. That may not sound that bad, but it's actually detrimental, because on top of the coral reefs are all of the critters and all the things that we saw from Michelle's presentation earlier. The ship is now crunching, crushing, and absolutely destroying anything underneath it. And it's absolutely at the mercy of the tide, the waves, the current, and whatever weather conditions. So there is no control on the magnitude of what the ship is actually doing once it has contacted the bottom. So in this particular incident, 1,500 square meters of coral reef were damaged after the ship became lodged. The estimated payment repairs for this were $1.4 million for restoration and damages just to the coral reef alone. So that was what was provided to the Philippines in order to repair and restore the damaged heritage site. The overall cost of removal was $45 million to remove the vessel. And the removal process went from January 17th, when it was originally lodged. The removal process began February 22nd. It was not removed completely until March 29th of 2013. So you asked why it took so long. They actually waited until the tides, depths, and currents were more suitable so that they could prevent additional damage that was already being caused. So the ship was completely drained of all of their oil and all of the toxins that would be there. All of the sailors were taken off, and it was left there to rock essentially there until they could figure out the most applicable way to do so. The picture in this is actually of the first tug, which was actually not suitable enough to complete the complete salvaging restoration process. Salvaging, the way I can kind of equate it, all of your salvagers are essentially your tow trucks of the ocean. So if you run aground or your car breaks down, the tow truck or the salvagers are going to be the ones that are going to come and actually save you. So this was the one that they actually ended up using, which obviously is much, much bigger. And they actually ended up cutting the ship into 3 to 4 separate pieces for removal, which originally, if you had asked this in the 1970s, was completely unheard of. We used to not actually cut up the ship. We would usually damage more environment to include dynamiting the areas around it to produce a channel so that it could easily move out on its own. So this led me to, this is, like I said, one of those pictures where we cut it into pieces. So this led me to add the question of who is out there and how often do these incidents occur? because to me this would be awfully detrimental, so I was pretty convinced that it was going to be a lot. Everyone was going to be doing a lot of damage, so now I was curious who actually is out there operating, how many people are out there, and how often they run aground. So this is one of the statistics that I looked at the maritime vessels. So these are the number of the ships that are actually registered in the maritime fleet. There are 52,183 over the course of them, and they vary from your most common, which is your general cargo ships. So those are your large ones that transport everything from Connex boxes, so think food, cars, equipment, from point A to point B, because actually 80% of the world imports and exports are transported via ship, because right now that is still the most cost-effective and most efficient way of shipping. Followed then by your more specialized carriers, which include bulk cargo carriers, as well as your specific tankers, oil, gas tankers, natural gases, any of those. I also looked at passenger ships. These are what they call the RoPax, which are any roll-on and roll-off freight transportation and passenger vessels. Those would be the Concordia, any of your cruise ships, as well as your ferries that get you from point A to point B, as well as other additional equipment. And those totaled to 4,428, currently registered in the year 2017. So what were the causes of ship loss? The statistic I was able to find was from 2016. Your primary loss of ship was from, essentially it was being sunk and submerged. A lot of the sunk and submerged ships occur from different accidents, but your absolutely the second most likely loss of a ship was due to wreck or grounding or stranding. So grounding can be intentional and unintentional. You may ask, why would I intentionally ground my vessel? Well, you would intentionally ground your vessel because you've suffered some sort of casualty, and so you don't want it to sink to the bottom of the ocean, which can cause more environmental damage. You actually bring it ashore so that you can chop it up into pieces and it can be recycled or salvaged. You also will see some of those in emergency situations if you're a vessel that can no longer operate on your own, so you've had an engineering casualty or a material equipment casualty and you're running into a storm. We don't want you to risk your life in said storm. We would rather you beach your ship and we'll come deal with it later. What I focus on specifically is the unintentional. So these are going to be the accidental. So a lot of these are continue to be caused by material and equipment issues, as well as human error and natural disasters. And here is your list of the number of ships lost worldwide by vessel type. And so cargo ships are your biggest loss, and they can either be from any of those ones that we had previously listed, followed then by fishing vessels, and then the third is your passenger ships. So what are the current salvage and damage assessments in place for post-maritime grounding accidents and their recovery? And then are the current protective measures in place maintaining the environmental integrity of areas impacted by maritime grounding? There are a couple different aspects that this actually encompasses. One is the legality, the advancement in salvaging techniques, as well as the public image. So now I'm going to tell you a story that actually moved to the legality portion of the salvaging techniques that we use today. So the Torrey Canyon disaster happened in 1967. Torrey Canyon may actually sound familiar to a lot of you because it was actually an oil tanker that was owned by the Union Oil Company out of California. And it was operating off the United Kingdom coast where it ran aground. So it ran aground on the protected reef in the United Kingdom off the southern coast. It spilled 25 to 36 million gallons of crude oil into the ocean. The UK took action since it was their sovereign waters to minimize the damage. The Royal Air Force actually were approved to bomb the vessel, to purposely sink it to prevent the additional crude damage from the oil spill, as well as the additional damage done by the grounding itself. So this became, at the time, the world's worst oil spill, and then continued to trigger changes in maritime law and damage responses. So in response to this, the International Maritime Organization created a legal committee which focused on any of the legal matters. The International Maritime Organization is a branch of the United Nations. They are the international governing body when it comes to all maritime issues. So they actually introduced rules and regulations that covered liability and compensation for damage caused by the ship. So one of your primary reasons that we changed our thought in dealing with environmental issues is that the insurance began to play in place. So it was no longer a concern for those people operating the ships to save the ship and the supplies on board. It then became the priority to save and rectify the environmental damage caused by those vessels, because they were going to be compensated on the back end for what was lost at the time. So this continues to be a prevalent issue, and it continues to be evaluated. So it actually created the compensation for oil pollution and damage, which continues to be the primary environmental damage issue. The grounding component actually came along in the 1990s, and they actually now meet twice a year, every year, to discuss current issues. They continue to change the liability and compensation rates, and they continue to use environmental data and scientific information to continue to raise and decrease the prices that the environmental damage will be received pending the actual assessment. So why is this an international issue? This is a look at all of these shipping lanes. They're all the blue lines of where all of the maritime traffic is. So this includes not only official shipping lanes, this is also where your private vessels, government vessels, all of those things operate. Some of the largest areas where most of the traffic occurs is actually where most of the accidents occur. So up near the Mediterranean, the Southern Pacific, and off the Caribbean are some of our primary areas that get affected by the grounding the most. So in response to that, the International Maritime Organization has created what are called particularly sensitive sea areas. Most of these actually correspond with the international marine protected areas and marine reserves that have been approved from various countries. Basically says that if you are a particularly sensitive area, you can get approval by the International Maritime Organization to reroute shipping around your protected areas. So we know that the accidents will most likely continue to happen because we cannot predict natural disasters nor human error. So the International Maritime Organization puts plan in place to remove the ships from that area in general. So this is one of those key elements that they continue to use, and they continue to reach out, and they meet twice a year to make sure that these are completely updated. And again, they continue to modify all of the shipping lanes based on the accidents that have occurred the year. So now we look on the national level. So the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association in the United States, they are the ones that actually control the US waters. So they will conduct, in US waters, they will conduct damage assessment, remediation, and restoration programs. These programs are complete and deep dive details that go into when the accident occurs all the way up to when they feel that the scientific community approves that their remediation has occurred. So as soon as the accident happens, NOAA and the US Coast Guard will work their efforts to make sure the salvaging is done correctly and to remove the ship as soon as possible, causing the least amount of environmental damage. Then they will continue to monitor those on an annual basis and also based on public feedback and recommendations from the particular area to continue to modify and the restoration plan and make sure that it's getting the funds that they need as well as the attention that it needs. So that leads me to, how are we really doing when it comes to maritime groundings? So the actual percentage of maritime groundings that occur, that 52,000 number and the 30 a year, actually only leads to 0.06% of maritime shipping accidents being groundings. And on the passenger vessel side, that was 4,423, and only 8 accidents a year leads to 0.2% a year of groundings. So those are the only time those incidents. So for me, that's less than 1%. Based on all of the legal issues at the IMO level, as well as the US state waters, we actually have this covered pretty well. We just happen to see a lot of the main effects of it, and a lot of them are very highly publicized, which get a lot of attention, but usually a lot of attention means they get a lot of money. And we actually have a lot of legislation and remediation problems in place to make sure that we track it so that the money is being used appropriately and we're restoring the damage that we did. So that would like me special thanks to Dr. Peter Franks and Doug Helton from NOAA who assisted me in this. And thank you very much for your time. Questions and comments?
Thanks, Katie. I feel like I learned a lot. And I agree with everything that Samantha said at the beginning about how wonderful you are. And so I'm interested how you're going to use this information and go forward in the future.
I come from a background of you cannot do away with a lot of things. You usually just come from the how can we do this better aspect. So I would certainly like to go back to the maritime community. And like I said, we can't change, we can't stop shifting from happening, but I do think we can do it better. And a lot of it is being done well. We just need to make sure that we're continuing to enforce it. So I would like to go back and work for a port operations or the International Maritime Organization would be a big lofty goal.
I was wondering how we fix prices of, what you pay if your ship runs aground, like the Guardian, for example. So, what was that a function of the fact that it was in a World Heritage Site, that there was this, multi-million-dollar settlement? Or is there some other set of criteria by which one judges, what the cost is to the country or the operator of the vessel?
Excellent question. And that's actually where a lot of inconsistencies occur because each country has its own policy and each country has their own value. So the Philippines actually evaluated an acre for $300. So that was kind of their rough estimate. And usually based on public opinion, especially when you're dealing with a government agency, they also will do their internal evaluation and provide the data that they use. But a lot of times you'll get private companies that actually get taken to court, so it falls under the judicial system, and they will then dictate how much they think. And that includes damages, restoration, then it goes through basically a civil suit.